At 27 years old, I've lived through many eras in gaming. I remember a time when brand new games were $50. You could rent new games from Blockbuster, when all I cared about was that a game was fun and cool. I didn't read online forums or reviews. I didn't care about bugs or wait for patch notes or updates. I just played. But I promise you, this isn't going to be one of those videos where I talk about how much greater things were back then, because as much as I sometimes long for a simpler time in gaming, the fact of the matter is that there has never been a better time to be a gamer. Sure, there's a lot of crap out there right now. Free gacha and mobile games that are predatory and just exist to steal your time and money. Games whose marketing budgets seem to outsize their development budget. And all the time, games come out that are overhyped and underdeliver, only to have the audacity to charge $60 or more for it. The AAA development world has consolidated into just a few massive corporations that have money and profit at the forefront of their mind, and the variety and quality in games releasing from these huge studios feels like it's never been worse. But despite all of that, I stand by that it has never been a better time to be a gamer. And the reason is simple. Indie games and the ever-increasing accessibility of both gaming and game development. In late 2020, the NVIDIA 30 series graphics cards dropped. I was starting to feel the limits of my 1070, and I, like many others, was still hoping that Cyberpunk 2077 would save my 2020 for being the absolute worst year of my life. So I ran to my local Micro Center and managed to cop a 3070 on the day that it dropped. And a new motherboard, and a new CPU, all amidst a looming shortage that would leave many people unable to get the hardware that they need to run new AAA games. In other words, I basically rebuilt my computer just to play Cyberpunk. And do I regret it? Not really. I more or less enjoyed Cyberpunk even though it wasn't everything I ever hoped for. And being able to run it with ray tracing and experience Night City in all its glory the way God intended definitely made up for the fact that the game wasn't exactly the second coming of Jesus Christ. But was it an experience worth like $1,000? Probably not. In fact, I'd go as far as to say definitely not. Because despite the hype for Cyberpunk and the lengths I went to have a good experience with it, my favorite game that I've played since 2020 has decidedly been Ultrakill. A game that I paid $15 for, and that can run on a literal potato because if you so please, you could make the game look like this. And through making content about this game and other games like it, I found that there is a common thread among the community. Many of the people who found their way to this game did so because they wanted an experience something like Doom Eternal, for example, but just couldn't run the modern AAA titles in the genre. Though there are just as many more like me who just like the game and the unique things it brings to the table, even though it isn't pushing the limits of their rig, the accessibility of this game in an era where many are struggling to get their hands on the latest hardware has clearly led to an increase in the popularity of it and other quote-unquote boomer shooters. But you can extend it even well beyond the massive resurgence of boomer shooters and retro-styled FPS games. Retro stylings have always been a mainstay in indie games for a number of reasons, but mainly because it is much easier to make games that look like this than like this, or this versus this. And as time goes on, this game looks like shit has been less of a direct knock to the quality of a game and more of a promise that even though the game maybe doesn't look like it's going to make your 1070 that isn't getting any younger cry, that what it lacks in graphical fidelity, it makes up for in passion and offers an experience that you can't get anywhere else. And it's not even close to impossible to make these games look incredible still. Media outlets often qualify games like this in this same manner when they talk about them, or dismiss retro-styled games as being trendy. But the truth is, they're ignoring the real reason why they're popular. Accessibility. As counterintuitive as it may sound. But the connotation of this word goes deeper than just more people can run it because it looks like shit. People like the retro style, at least when it's executed well. But the real appeal and catalyst for its popularity is not so much on the end of the consumer as it is on the end of the developer. Not to say that there isn't a certain allure to a well-executed retro style, and that low-poly and pixelated games can't also be beautiful, or that it doesn't appeal to a certain sense of nostalgia that games that look like they were made, this decade just can't quite capture. But in truth, the tools for making games of this style have never been better and more accessible to the average person. And I'm not even just talking about experienced developers. Given enough time and effort, the average person can learn Blender and Unity and whatever other tools they need to make a game, mostly for free on YouTube or online, and get their game listed on Steam or whatever. There is an astronomically low barrier of entry to becoming a game developer. Obviously, there's way more to making a good game than just downloading Unity. You have to create art, assets, a gameplay loop that is fun and engaging, and solo development comes with all sorts of its own challenges on top of that. But reasonably, the time has never been better than now to, as an individual person, go from the inception of an idea to a completed game without investing much more than just time. And that's just insanely cool. And all of this, like I said before, comes amidst a general consolidation of the AAA development space. But it's not just a consolidation of companies and studios, there's also a consolidation of ideas. Bold ideas are not often rewarded with record-breaking sales, so the games that look like this have also often been deliberately engineered by teams of people trying to make their game the most inoffensive and widely appealing one out of the bunch. It's almost like the pretty games are expected to disappoint these days with a shallow experience, while the ugly ones, though not all a slam dunk, at least offer the potential of something truly different and compelling. I feel like a great microcosm of this happened very recently that illustrated the important place of retro games in the current landscape, and the opportunities they offer developers. What if I told you that you can play Bloodborne, which is historically a pure PlayStation exclusive, natively on PC right now, in high resolution, at frame rates above 30 and even 60? Now, don't get too excited because for one, it isn't the full game, 2, it looks like this, and 3, it isn't exactly a one-to-one remake, though I'd argue this isn't even a negative as some cool choices have been made that benefit the experience overall. But despite that, the Bloodborne PSX demake offers an authentic experience to the original Bloodborne as well as to the retro PSX era games that inspired the aesthetic. And it was all made entirely by one woman as a pure passion project and released for free. For obvious legal reasons. But still, to do all of this with such an impressive scope and attention to detail for nothing more than the love of Bloodborne and retro aesthetics is astonishing. And it was met with an overwhelming reception, most notably amassing 22,000 plus concurrent viewers on Twitch, a handful of which were me. Hi, twitch.tv/dumpstermanttv, link in the description. Which should go without saying was more than Bloodborne itself had on that night, and almost definitely more than some newly released AAA titles around that time. And again, the reason is purely accessibility related. One need only download the game for free and boot it up to start playing Bloodborne on their PC. No PS4 or even really a good PC required. As impressive of an accomplishment as Bloodborne PSX was, the argument can still be made that much of the conceptual work of creating the gameplay concept and the world of Bloodborne can still be credited to From Software, even though the engine, gameplay, and art were still built from the ground up for this PSX demake. A lot of the legwork had already been done, which is a fair criticism of using this game as an example. I still think the solo developer deserves an immense amount of credit for finding a way to do the work that took a team of hundreds years to complete, with the only substantial difference being the retro art style, and it really goes to show the potential of solo and small dev teams harnessing a retro style to make truly impressive works of art that suffer only in the realm of graphical fidelity and wow factor. And even still, the demake undoubtedly captures the spirit and aesthetic of Bloodborne in a faithful and appealing way, without much graphical fidelity at all to work with. But if that example doesn't quite do it for you, allow me to evoke a similar example that takes inspiration from a similar source, but uses it to create something entirely new. Lunacid is another From Software-inspired game created by a solo developer. Rather than being inspired by Bloodborne, it took inspiration from earlier games like King's Field and Shadow Tower, titles that predate the Souls franchise. But instead of being directly inspired by them, it is clear that Lunacid is drawing both from these older games, modern From Software titles like Dark Souls and Bloodborne, but also the developer Kira's other work, and the result is something totally unique, but that succeeds on many fronts. On one hand, even in early access, the game is expansive, has an intriguing but mysterious narrative developing, and a simple but extremely compelling combat and progression system. And best of all, the game is wrapped up in a retro style that I at least personally think is extraordinarily compelling and even beautiful. And you can play it right now for $7, which almost feels like highway robbery for a game this good and passionately constructed. Games like Lunacid and Bloodborne PSX, as well as retro FPS games like Ultrakill, show the potential that improved and accessible 3D development tools, as well as a commitment to a retro style, have for indie developers to make cohesive and unique experiences that can rival the quality of AAA games in all but their boundary-pushing graphics. And this is extremely welcome in a time where not only are AAA games becoming increasingly difficult, expensive, and time-consuming to develop, while also struggling to stay on the cutting edge, but as the modern hardware and components required to run them seem to be becoming more scarce and expensive, they also seem to be becoming less accessible in and of themselves. The recent runaway success of Elden Ring has given me hope that not all is lost here, that a game that is both ambitious, consistent and unique in its vision, and doesn't place an outsized importance on being on the bleeding edge of modern graphics, though don't get me wrong, it still looks very nice, has captured everyone's attention, has given me hope that some AAA developers are paying attention to what the indie development world has been trending towards already for years. And hopefully these lessons will be imparted from Elden Ring as well. The general failure of Cyberpunk in the court of public opinion had me worried that the wrong message was being received by AAA devs, that it's better to be safe than sorry. But time will tell how both the slowdown in development, the scarcity in hardware of the last few years, and the reactions to what few big releases there have been over the past few years will cause things to change in the AAA space. But for now, the one constant through turmoil in both the world and the game development space is that the most exciting, forward-thinking, unique, and masterful games seem to be coming out of the indie and especially the retro space. So while there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting something that looks cool, feels familiar, and will be a guaranteed sink of tens if not hundreds of hours of your time, maybe the next time you're looking for something to play, instead of buying the latest and greatest, take a plunge into something that maybe looks weird or different, because I firmly believe that this is where gaming's greatest experiences are at the moment. Where ambitious, up-and-coming developers are making awesome games based on unique and uncompromised visions. And because if what you want is for games to be accessible and forward-thinking, then believe it or not, retro games are truly the future. Thanks for watching.
Hit that like button.
Alright.
Smash that bell, hit that bell button, hit
Destroy my pussy.
Subscribe to Dumper Man.